Inventing Reality. Section. The Graying of Reality. Much news media framing is designed not to excite or incite, but to neutralize. While we think of the press as geared to crisis and sensationalism, often its task is just the opposite, dedicated to the graying of reality, blurring popular grievances and social inequities. In this muted media reality, those who raise their voices too strongly against the bland tide can be made to sound quite shrill. Instead of neutralizing themselves as observers, reporters and editors are more likely to neutralize their subject matter, giving it an innocence it may not deserve. One way to do this is by applying gloss-over euphemisms and passive phrases. We have already noted how the New York Times reported that President Salvador Allende of Chile, quote, died in the Moneda Palace, when actually he had been murdered there by the military. The Times turned the 1973 Chilean coup, in which tens of thousands were victimized, into a neutral event by using bland phrases like, quote, the armed forces took power, and telling us that the, quote, chaos caused by the communists, quote, brought in the military. When men, women, and children in the villages of Morazan province were massacred by the Salvadoran army, the Times described it as a military operation in which some 500 civilians reportedly died in El Mozote. The Washington Post treated the Morazan massacre with sentences like, quote, a survivor broke down only when speaking of what she said were the deaths of her children, and, quote, like so much else in the civil war that is racking this tiny country, these conflicting accounts are impossible to verify, end quote. The destruction of trade unions and other popular organizations, and the many other acts of repression, murder, and torture by a fascist military regime in Turkey, were described in the Washington Post as, quote, controversial measures, and as a, quote, drive to restrict political dissent. We learned that General Kenan Evren, the despot of Turkey, has a, quote, down-to-earth approach, and involves himself in the, quote, rough and tumble of everyday politics, and that his current crackdown, quote, had all but stamped out terrorism. As if his democratic opponents were terrorists, and the Evren regime itself was not engaging in terrorism. Faced with the genocide in East Timor perpetrated by the Indonesian military, complete with widespread burning of crops and intensive aerial bombings of the countryside to starve out and destroy the population that supported the guerrillas, the Washington Post could neutralize as follows, quote, more than 100,000 islanders, 1/6 of the population, died in the famine and disease brought on by the hostilities, end quote, and, quote, the warfare between the Indonesians and Federal forces further disrupted the fragile agrarian economy and caused heavy casualties, end quote. The Indonesians did not starve out and massacre multitudes. The warfare impersonally, quote, caused heavy casualties. "16 years after a democratically elected president was murdered in Chile, the New York Times' Shirley Christian was still glossing over the event with phrases like, President Allende, quote, died in the course of the coup. In 1991, the Washington Post reported that in El Salvador, quote, deep hatreds and the, quote, killing of civilians has left some 75,000 dead, end quote. a use of the passive voice that conveniently avoids telling us who did the killing. As for South Africa, we are told by the Times that a protest by black squatters, quote, led to clashes with police in which 18 people died, end quote. What does led to a clash mean? Didn't the police open fire on the demonstrators? How is it the, quote, people died? Was it from heat stroke, heart attack? Or were they not killed by the police? The article does not tell us. In another article, the Times noted that the, quote, Mozambique countryside has been devastated, end quote. By whom? Was it not by the South African-backed mercenary Renamo forces that for years deliberately wreaked death and terror upon the civilian population of Mozambique? According to the Neutralizing Times, the devastation was, quote, a result of the conflict that pitted the anti-communist Renamo against, quote, the Marxist government. On Angola, the Washington Post reported, quote, scores of government health centers have been burned down in the countryside, apparently by the rebels, end quote. If the word, quote, apparently had not been inserted, the report would have sounded less measured, less, quote, objective, but would have been more truthful. The rebels were the right-wing UNITA forces that received $50 million a year in covert military aid from the United States. Another way to neutralize the news is by scanting its content. We noted how the media are able to reduce political campaigns to a string of issueless, trivial pseudo-events, and feed us stories about labor management conflicts, political protests, and revolutionary and socialist countries, without ever telling us much about their substance, about the interests and goals motivating the event makers. When political struggles are deprived of their content, as when positions taken in opposition to U.S. policy are never explained in their substance, we are left with the presumption that the conflict is caused by an innately hostile adversary. By slighting content and dwelling on surface details, the media are able to neutralize the truth while giving an appearance of having thoroughly treated the subject. End of section.